So it seems to work. Wonderful, wonderful. Welcome. No. It needs so much. Good, wonderful. It seems to work. Welcome everybody here from the St. Paul's Abbey in Oosterhout. We're so glad that you're with us in all the different places where you're watching us. Thank you so much to spend this afternoon together with this workshop, Europe What's Up. My name is Tobias. I'm a youngster in the Chemin Neuf Community, and I'm originally from Switzerland.
Yes, also welcome to our French-speaking listeners. We have 2 live streams. So if you are listening and you want to follow it in French, si tu veux suivre en français, tu peux suivre l'autre live stream. My name is Charlotte. I'm from the Netherlands. And I grew up here in this country, and now I'm a member of the Chemin Neuf Community. And yeah, if you're just watching, this is the workshop Europe What's Up. We have our guests with us. We are very happy to welcome Jeff and Romkje Fountain. Maybe we can applaud, although maybe you're just at home alone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can clap. Yes, we are very happy. Jeff and Romkje, where are you now? Where are you sitting?
We are right down in the center of Amsterdam, opposite the central station, where the Amstel River used to flow out into what is called the A, the piece of water that comes by, and that's where Amsterdam began. And we are in our, what we call the upper room gathering of the Schuman Centre, and these days we call it the upper Zoom.
Yes,
that's the way to connecting these days.
Yes, it's very nice we can connect like this together this afternoon. It's really a miracle that everything worked out. We are God very thankful that it's possible and that we can learn a lot this afternoon together. Actually, maybe everyone who is listening now can also participate, because we have also a chat, and there is a chance to ask also questions. You can write it all the time during this workshop. So if you have a question for Romkje or for Jeff, you can write them in the chat. And maybe it's nice actually if people are now watching, that you really can join and to write your name, your country, so that we can really see who is joining us right now. So please write your name, say hello, and we can yeah, really share this afternoon together.
Oh, wonderful. Maybe you ask, where are we here sitting? We have seen all these bricks behind us. We're in the St. Paul's Abbey, as I mentioned at the beginning. The St. Paul's Abbey is a former Benedictine monastery in Oosterhout, it's south of the Netherlands, more or less. So, it was given by the Benedictine monks to the community in 2006. And now we're here together with 40 young peoples from a lot of different countries, especially from Germany and the Netherlands, but also a lot from Switzerland. And we lived here for 2 weeks together, a small version of the festival. We called it Summer in the Monastery. We had 2 opportunities. Once there was the opportunity to be a whole week in silence, to do a retreat. And the other was called Ora et Labora week, which was a week where they, as the motto of the Benedictine monks says, they worked a lot. They had a few workshops. For example, they brewed beer in the tradition of the monasteries here in the Netherlands and in Belgium too. They also did calligraphy and had a lot of time to pray, over this monastic life. The monks lived here for 99 years.
So we have this this afternoon together in 2 parts, because Romkje can really share something from her heart to us, and after also Jeff. So we have really like the opportunity to hear 2 different speeches, and after every speech, it's also a little time to ask questions. So we can also really have like a dialogue. through us, we can ask the questions, also your questions, if you write them in the chat, and Jeff and Romkje can answer us. So feel free, and yeah, that's how you know that that there's a little pause with questions in between the two. Yes, maybe I can introduce Jeff and Romkje. So they're married already for 45 years. They live in Amsterdam, like I said, in the Netherlands. And Jeff is a native English speaker because he's from New Zealand. He came in the Netherlands in 1973, and he fell in love with his lovely wife, Romkje. And actually, it's not the topic of today, but maybe when we have some time in the end of this afternoon, we can ask them how that happens. Yes, together they were leading the training school of Youth with a Mission. And Jeff was also for 20 years the director, European director of Youth with a Mission. So now for 10 years, we started the Schuman Centre for European Studies. And with these activities, they promote the biblical Christian perspective on Europe, on the past, the present, and the future of Europe. Yeah, you will hear a lot more about this afternoon. Yes, Romkje?
Yes, I will present the story that really touched me in the preparation for this workshop. I didn't knew the woman she will be talking about very well, but it will be Corrie ten Boom here in the Netherlands, a very famous woman, and she was living, especially during the Second World War time, really really had a big influence in Europe, and I think it's the best just to say, Romkje, start with your speech, because I think you have so much more to say than I just read on the internet, because you've worked with her, you've experienced a lot.
Okay, we need to share our screen then, and we hope this works. Let's see. So is everything as it should be on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, it's over to you, Romkje.
And can you see me too?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, when I was a young secretary, I was asked to work for Corrie, which was a great honor, really, because I was very young and she was very old. And let me tell you about her life. She was 22 in the city of Amsterdam, actually. But when she was a few years old, she and her family moved to Haarlem, to the watch shop that her grandfather had started. Now, Corrie was the youngest of 4 children. You see her on the right of the picture here. Her older sister was Betsy. And then there was Willem, the only boy in the family, and then Nolly and Corrie. When Corrie was born, she was born on April the 15th in 1892. She was very premature, and they did think she wouldn't live. However, with the family, not only lived the father and the mother, but also 3 of the old aunts, sisters of her mother. And one of them had been a nanny to a family, and she knew how to look after children. So she took the little baby Corrie, who was very blue, and put her in the apron and put her under her hat. In those days, there were no incubators. So that's how Corrie survived. And actually, she didn't die till she was 91. She died on her 91st birthday. So this is her parents, Casper on the right and Cornelia on the left. So this one here, okay. And so this is a picture of the family some years later. Nolly, Betsy, father, mother, Willem, and Betsy. Now, as I said, not only did the family live with the 4 children, they had 3 elderly aunts living with them. And this is the most important of the aunts. This was Tante Jans. And Tante Jans, Auntie Jans, had been married to a pastor. And she was very much wanting the family to still be involved in evangelism. And so she would take Corrie to go with her to the soldiers who lived in Haarlem as well. And Corrie would have to play the organ. So this is the very, very tiny workshop and watch shop in Haarlem. If you ever come to Holland, I recommend that you go there because it gives you such a picture of what the family was like. And it's incredible to think that they lived there with the 4 children plus the 3 aunts as well. Now, in the front of the building was the actual shop, and then there was a dividing between the workshop and the shop. And you see here on the left, Father ten Boom, Casper, and Corrie next to her. Corrie became the first licensed Dutch watchmaker. And Tobias, this is interesting for you, woman watchmaker, because she learned the trade, of course, in Switzerland. Father ten Boom had sold a clock that he earned enough money for Corrie to go to Switzerland and learn how to be the first female Dutch watchmaker. Corrie's father was a very excellent watchmaker. He wrote in all the European magazines about how to fix watches, but he was a very bad businessman. So this is, I think, gives you a very good idea of how the shop and the house was organized. When the aunts started to live with the family, Father ten Boom bought the little house that was behind the front house. It had a little street in between, and they put the 2 houses together, and the little street became the winding stairway up to the top. Now, this is very important to realize that, because this made the house very, you really didn't know on which floor you were, because all the floors were a little bit different. And when you look at this picture on the left-hand side is where Corrie's bedroom was. And on the top, right as far away from the workshop as possible. And that's where a double wall was built for the in the hiding place. I hope you can see it, because here on this picture on the left-hand side, right on the top, you have Corrie's room and then the hiding place, and then you see how the whole house was divided. Now, Corrie not only was a watchmaker, but she and the family did a lot of social work. And after Willem got married and Nolly got married, Corrie and her father and Betsy is on the right-hand side in the corner, they took in children. They fostered 14 children before the war started, which not many people realize that, because all you ever hear about Corrie is the life in the concentration camp and after the war. But her whole life had been a preparation of what God called her to do after the war. And so Corrie started children's clubs and young people's clubs in Haarlem, as well as having these foster children. They had a lot of laughter in the house. They were very poor, but they were very musical. They were very educated. And it was very much an open house. this is when Corrie was a social worker, as well as leading these clubs. And in her book, she writes about that very full of humor, because she was a very untidy woman. And her sister Betsy would always tell her, Corrie, your seam is out of your dress, please fix it. And Corrie would just put a safety pin in it. And but it made her a very kind of a real person. So here you see her again, Corrie. The other very interesting thing about the family is that in the years when nobody was really interested in the fate of the Jews very much, Corrie's grandfather, Willem, he started in this house in 1844 a prayer meeting for the Jews and for the peace of Jerusalem, never knowing that exactly 100 years later, God answered that prayer in a very unusual way, is when the house was invaded by Germans. So on the 10th of May, and Corrie writes about that as well in her books, when she and Betsy were asleep early in the morning, they woke up by the bombs being dropped on on Rotterdam. Haarlem and Rotterdam are not very far away from each other, so they could very clearly hear those bombs being dropped. And although the Dutch believed that within 5 days they would be liberated, it took 5 long years of occupation. And so Corrie started an underground work together with Willem, who was very much involved in the place where he lived in Hilversum, and with Willem's son Kik, to start to help the Jews and the other underground workers. Now, this picture here should have never been taken, of course, because if the Germans would have found this picture, it would have been really dangerous. You see Father in the middle of the picture here, and Betsy on the right, and Corrie behind her father, where they were with some of the people that were hiding in their house. I showed you earlier where the hiding place was. If the Germans would come in, the Jews that were there could go up the stairs and hide in this room. Now, some of these Jews, they were real men, and the guy on the left-hand side in the picture with the glasses, his name was the cantor in the synagogue in The Hague. He had never done any housework, and so Corrie made him do the dishes as well as peel the potatoes.
Right,
and
the one there?
the one in the middle with the glasses on. I don't know whether you can see me pointing out. And then on the right-hand side, you see them sitting around the table. They try to be as normal as possible. But in the workshop, Corrie had a bell underneath her working bench. And when she pushed the bell, the people that were illegally in the house, there were also always legal people there, like Corrie and her father and Betsy. And they would have to go up the stairs and hide in the hiding place. So this is Corrie's room. And in the back wall, they built this extra wall, and they built it with bricks because they had been told by the experts they should never just put in a wall made by wood, because the Germans could knock on it and realize this is not a real wall, but it had to be built with bricks. And so the masons came in, built this brick there, and they smuggled the bricks in the grandfather clocks. And on the left-hand side of that wall was a built-in cupboard, and on the bottom of that cupboard, this is again for you to see how this hiding place was built. here on the left. And on the bottom of that cupboard, there was a little place that you could crawl through to get into the hiding place. Of course, this hole wasn't there in the wall. That was really built when it became a museum so that people could see how very small it was. And it actually was only built to house 4 people for 2 hours. But when the Germans came, 6 people had to be in there for 2 whole days. So when they pushed the button, these people had to go on these winding stairs upstairs, and Corrie drilled them so that they could be there within a minute. I think the quickest they ever did it was 91 seconds. And also on the stairs was this little cubicle where they would be hiding the illegal ration cards. And actually that was also, they hoped that if the Germans would find that they thought that was all the illegal things they did in that house. Of course, with all the preparations of tests to get the people up the stairs as quickly as possible, they hoped that it would never be needed to use this room. But on the 28th of February, by a traitor, they were invaded by the Germans. On that day, 34 people were arrested by the Germans, and most of them later, they had nothing to do with what was happening there because they had a prayer meeting at that afternoon. They could go, they were released from prison, but Betsy, Corrie, Willem and father all went into the prison. After 2 days, some good policemen knocked at the wall and said, this is Willem, or whatever the name was of this good policeman. And they opened a little latch and the people could come out of the hiding and go through this window and escape over the roofs of Haarlem. It was a miracle that the Germans never found them, which was a wonderful blessing for Corrie to realize that their offer was not in vain. So Corrie and Betsy were first sent to the prison in Scheveningen, where Father ten Boom died after 10 days. And Corrie and Betsy were both put in solitary confinement. And then after the invasion came in the early spring of 1944, they were first sent to Vught. And when the south of Holland was liberated, they were sent to Ravensbrück. The family paid a very high price for their help to the Jews. And in the old house, it's now a museum. There is this plaque which says the 4 members of the ten Boom family who died: Casper, the father; Betsy, who died in Ravensbrück; Willem, who died from the meningitis after the war, because that's what he contracted in the concentration camp; and Kik, Corrie's nephew, he died in Bergen-Belsen, but they never knew till 7 years after the war that he had actually died. Now, these are some of the pictures of the concentration camp that Corrie and Betsy were in. And these are drawings that some person did who was in the concentration camp. The women had to sleep 3 stories high in these very small beds. If you had to get out in the night, you know, you had to crawl over these people. And Corrie and Betsy were sent to a place where there were a lot of lice. And when they came there, Betsy said to Corrie, the Bible tells us to thank God for everything. So Corrie, we should thank for the lice. And Corrie thought Betsy has really gone crazy. But later, Corrie agreed with Betsy. Because of the lice, the Germans were always very scared of lice and contagious diseases. So they never came to this barrack. And Corrie and Betsy could share with these women about the, they had smuggled a little Bible into the concentration camp, and they could share with these women about the love of Jesus, even in these horrible circumstances. Every morning, they had to go and stand on roll call for hours in the cold. And in one of Corrie's book writes that it was a terrible thing. And then one day, a lark, was it a lark? A bird came and sang. And it so focused her eyes on something different than the terrible suffering they had in this concentration camp. And here you see some of these women sitting, listening to the stories of the Bible, because Corrie and Betsy knew that most of these women's lives would only be maybe a week or 2 weeks before they would have to go to the gas chambers there. 2 days before Betsy died, she woke Corrie up in the middle of the night and she said, Corrie, when we are released, we need to go into all the world and tell people that even if the most horrible thing happens, God's everlasting arms are still underneath us. 2 days later, Betsy died. And a week after, Corrie was released, and she often have heard her say, through a blunder of man and a miracle of God. So Corrie then came back to Holland, and what Betsy had shared with Corrie, she had seen a picture of a beautiful house where they would take people in who had suffered in the concentration camps and where they could be rehabilitated. And this is Corrie standing in front of this beautiful house. And also Betsy had said, Corrie, we need to get one of these former concentration camps and fill it with color and flowers, because color and flowers will heal these people of the grayness of this concentration camp. And so then Corrie opened this shelter in Darmstadt after the war. And then in 1946, very shortly after the war, Corrie began to travel the world to tell people the message of Jesus, that Jesus loves us, is always there, but that we need to forgive. And that was Corrie's main message. We can always trust Jesus, even when the worst happens, but the importance of forgiveness. So Corrie has written many books. When I worked for her, I sometimes helped with correcting the translation of the books. And in 1977, she moved to America, and where she lived the last years of her life. And she died on her 91st birthday. And the last 5 years of her life, she couldn't travel anymore. She was bedridden, but Jeff and I visited her there a few times, and it was, she was so, all that had been invested in her life, you could still see it, because she was at total peace. She served God when she could serve him with her voice and with her life, but even when she couldn't do that anymore, she still served him. So what I want to tell you is something that I often read from her book, but that's a little bit difficult on this Zoom. So I just tell you the story that I've often heard her tell. In 1947, which was only 2 years after the war, God called her to come back to Germany, and she had really vowed to herself that she would never go back to Germany. But when she asked God where she should visit next, she didn't hear at all from him. And then finally she said, do you want me to go back to Germany? And then she felt that God said yes, but you didn't want to go, so I couldn't tell you. So she spoke in a church in Munich, and she said, when I spoke in Germany, so shortly after the war, people always left the church very quiet. And then nobody asked a question. And then I saw him, she said. He came forward while all the other people were going out of the church. A man in a gray coat, but I immediately recognized him as one of the guides in Ravensbrück, one of the most cruel ones.
The guards.
One of the guards, yes. And he came forward and he said, Fraulein, Miss ten Boom, since the war, I've become a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus now. And I know my sins are forgiven, but could you please also tell me that you forgive me? And Corrie said that was the most difficult thing I ever had to do. Could I so easily forgive him? When Betsy died such a terrible death in that concentration camp, my father died because of the Germans. But, she said, I knew it had to happen, despite the temperature of my heart, because I knew that forgiveness was not a feeling, it was something you decided to do. And so I said, oh God, help me to forgive this man. And so the man said again, because she said it, I stood there absolutely frozen. And then he said again, Fraulein, could you forgive me? And she said, then I said, I gave my hand to him and we shook hands, and it started, she said, in my shoulder, this warm feeling, and it went over my arm into our hands, and all of a sudden, she said, this warmth filled my whole being, and I had tears in my eyes, and I said to him, brother, I forgive you with all my heart. And I've heard her tell this story so many times, because in forgiving him, she forgave all the Germans. And that was such a powerful message. If there was one person that I've seen living out of this forgiveness, and she had experienced something as terrible as few people, I think, experience in their lifetimes. And she forgave this man. And so working for her as a young person, you can imagine the enormous influence it has had on my life, the importance of forgiveness, the importance of trusting God, even when life is difficult. And so I feel very privileged that I was able to learn from this woman. And so this is one of her sayings. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives us, along with the command, the love itself. And Corrie had many wonderful sayings, but also her Bible verses that she shared with people were amazing. She said, he throws our sins in the depths of the sea. And not only that, but he puts the sign up, fishing forbidden, fishing not allowed. When he forgives our sins, they're gone. He will remember them no more. That's what Hebrews says. And not only does he throw them in the ocean, but he moves them as far away from us as the east is from the west. And so you can go to the museum, you can take a tour on the screen. What do you call it? A digital tour, a virtual tour. And
if you go to that address.
So you have to go to tenboom.org. And so this is my story of Corrie ten Boom, who died on her 91st birthday after the doctor thought she wouldn't live any longer than 3 weeks. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing the testimony of Corrie ten Boom with us, especially you as her former secretary. I think you can close the screen sharing now. Thank you so much. It will be to the image, the seers and the live stream. Thank you so much. This story just touched me so deeply, especially that it was hard, and she realized I'm not able to forgive this former garden in Ravensbrück, but with the help of God, she could really do this step with all of her heart. Corrie ten Boom had also a very, very calling with the youth, as you mentioned, that her whole life preparation for her work after the war. You experience this calling for the youth in Europe and all around the world in your work.
You know, I've told this story so many times, but it still touches my heart so much, you know, because it's a story of real life, isn't it? It's not a theoretical thing, but it's something that happened, and I knew her, and I've seen the importance of forgiveness, and not only forgive, but also ask for forgiveness, like what this German guy did, and then there could be reconciliation. That's an amazing story.
It is.
And I think we just have time for one question. And actually, maybe you can tell us more about, because you worked really with Corrie ten Boom. How can you tell us a little bit like how she was for personality to work with her, and also yes, what kind of heart she also had for young people like us.
Yeah. You know, she loved young people. Even when she was in her 80s, you know, she would talk about the old people like they would always be complaining, you know. She would love to be with young people. And she always found ways to communicate with young people. I remember one time she said, some students are coming and I'm going to play chess with them, because they don't just want to be sitting around, you know, doing nothing. And so she would play chess with them. And she was she had a lot of humor. Like the first time I met her, you know, she asked me by letter to become her secretary. And so I had already worked for her a few months before she came back, and I actually met her, and I hadn't really cooked enough food. So we ate soup from very small bowls with small spoons, because it would last a bit longer. And then she had this little twinkle in her eye, and she would say, you know, this is just like eating soup with a fork. And I thought, eating soup with a fork, what does she mean? And she said,
Kissing is like
eating soup with a fork is like kissing. And I thought, okay. And then she said, you never get enough of it. And that was my exam from Corrie, you know, if I could appreciate her joke. And I just thought it was so funny. Here she was almost 80 years old. She'd never been married. And here she could make these really funny remarks. She was a woman full of fun. You know, like one time she spoke in a church in Denmark, and she talked about the importance of going the second mile, you know. And so she went up to the people that had invited her, asked to come for lunch, and she had to go up a lot of stairs, and she wasn't very pleased because there wasn't a lift. And so, but when she came to the top of the stairs, here were these people, and she asked them, do you know Jesus? And they said no. So she prayed for them, and she could let them to accept the Lord. And then when she came back down the stairs, she said, you know what? Corrie ten Boom should listen to her own sermons a little bit better. And so she had a lot of she could laugh at herself as well. And I think that is what I so remember about her, that she wasn't, you know, a boring old lady, but she was full of fun. If you look at her, you know, the old pictures, she has always very colorful clothes on, and a lot of smiles. the old,
She's very real.
she was really real, you know. And one time I did something wrong and I got really told off by her. But then I said, oh, Tante Corrie, I'm so sorry. And she said, I forgive you, she said. And she said to me the same thing as she said to this God, with all my heart. And then 3 months later, I reminded her of it. And she looked at me and she really had forgotten about it. So you can realize, you know, what a deep impact she had on my life as a real person, a person full of humor, not a complainer, loved color, loved spoiling people. A lot of wonderful life lessons I learned from her. Tobias, I can't hear you.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for this testimony to share with us. This woman who really lived what she believed.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think I can listen for hours. It's about his heartbeat for Europe and about how this testimony of reconciliation.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you for listening.
Because your wife also loves really to talk, and I think she has a lot to say.
All right, I'm not hearing you very well, but let me see where. Yes. Well, the story I want to tell you now is complementary to what Romkje has just talked about. It's also about forgiveness, about reconciliation. So I can see you, Charlotte. Is everything good? I've got the right screen. You can hear me well? Okay. The name of this afternoon workshop is Europe, What's Up? And to really understand what is happening in Europe today, we need to be able to understand where we've come from. And there's a huge problem is that there's a whole generation of young people who are not really told the full story from the past, because we're taught by people who often don't believe in spiritual things. And it's like going to a 3D theater. And the manager comes out and says, no, we hope you enjoy this, the film today, this 3D film. Unfortunately, we don't have any glasses for you. Well, everybody would boo and hiss and ask for their money back, because without the glasses, you don't see the extra dimension. And this is a problem today with our history teachers, with our academics, with our journalists, with our politicians. They are often tone deaf to the spiritual. And because of that, we have a warped understanding of reality. We do not see what God has done in the past, what he's doing amongst us today, and he wants to do in the future. And Christians of all people need to be three-dimensional people, people who understand where we've come from and where we're going to. Jesus said that. I know who I am, I know where I've come from, I know where I'm going to. And that's why the Bible is a book with three dimensions. Both books of the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, start with books about the past. They end with books about the future. And then in between, they have books about how to live in the present between what God has done in the past and what he wants to do in the future. And we Christians need to be three-dimensional people who are rooted in the past, knowing what God has done in the past. And this is why we have history books in the Bible. We need to be focused on the future, understanding what God is wanting to do on planet Earth, so that we can align our lives now with his purposes, to be effectively engaged in the present. I'll say that again. We need to be rooted in the past, focused on the future, in order to be effectively engaged in the present. And when we ask the question, Europe, what's up? We need the historical background of the Bible. We need the future perspective the Bible gives us to understand what's happening in Europe so we can align our lives with where God is working towards. And this has to do with also understanding the story of the war and what happened after the war. Just this week, we have been holding a summer school of European studies. And each evening, we actually did an online Celtic heritage trip as we went right through Ireland, Scotland, England, and then back across onto the continent as we saw the story of faithful minorities who transformed those nations into believing countries. Now, of course, there's a great mix of belief and unbelief today, but to understand what made those nations what they've been, we need to understand the transforming story of Jesus, because the greatest single factor in shaping Europe's past has been the story of Jesus. Why shouldn't that same story of Jesus be the greatest single factor in shaping Europe's future? And what we need today is a generation of people who have faith and hope and vision for the future of Europe, because when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we are praying, Lord, may your will be done here on earth, here in Europe, as it is in heaven. It is what God wants to do. It's what God wants to happen, is to see his kingdom come on this planet in our continent, as well as the rest of the world. But we're here in Europe, that's our responsibility. But there are so many Christians who believe, oh, God has planned for Europe to get worse and worse, and it's going to become the beast and so forth. And they are trapped in fatalism. This is not Christianity. This is fatalism. And we need to believe he really wants to see his kingdom come, his will to be done in Europe as it is in heaven. I may be very simple, but I believe that it's always God's will for his will to be done. That doesn't always happen at all. No, lots of things happen in history that are not God's will. It wasn't God's will for Israel to wander around in the desert for 40 years. But it's never God's will for God's will not to be done. And so when we understand that God has always used faithful minorities to work out his purposes in history, and we see that through the Bible and we see that through history, then we need to recognize it's our turn now. We are to be faithful minorities who help shape the future. And that includes Europe. And that's why it's so important for us to understand the European story from God's perspective. Now, everybody knows who won the Second World War. But the big question is, who won the peace? You see, in 1945, when the guns fell silent, Europe was left with a severe case of post-trauma stress disorder. The troops came through, as we see in these photos in the north, the Canadians coming through in Holland, and all the soldiers were giving out chocolates and cigarettes and kisses, and then went home and everybody lived happily ever after. No, that was not how it happened at all. Europe was in a terrible mess. Europe was a broken continent, broken cities, broken nations, broken families, broken communities. And here's a picture of Dresden after the terrible bombing of the Allies of Dresden. Surely a war crime, but never held account for it, with so many thousands of men and women and children who are not involved in the conflict directly being obliterated through that. And there's a statue in the city of Rotterdam that's a statue shown here with the sun shining through a gap where its heart used to be. It was a city with the heart blown out that happened on the 10th of May of 1940 with the Blitzkrieg, when Hitler destroyed the inner heart of the city of Rotterdam. But that represents the whole of Europe. This is how Europe was after the war. And it was a time of terrible anguish, especially in Germany. Women who didn't know if their men were ever going to still alive, if they'd ever come back home. And many of you will know some family stories of the terrible time it was after the war. We tend to forget that because we don't know our history. We don't realize, it wasn't just a matter of winning a military war. Hearts had to change. So the story I want to tell you is about the heart change that took place that was very necessary for peace to come to Europe and Europe to begin to rebuild in such a way that today the world looks towards Europe as a model of all these different former enemies who have come together and found a way to live in the European house without war. This is a story with the gospel at the heart. This is our story. We should know it. We should pass it on, because we cannot expect politicians to pass on this story. We in our faith communities are the ones who should be carrying this story and passing it on and retelling this story. And but it begins with a man named Robert Schuman. At least my story does begin with this man. He was, you probably may have never heard of him. You've heard of Robert Schuman, who spells his name with 2 N's, and he's the composer. Some of you perhaps play Schumann tunes on your piano. This is another Robert Schuman who lived 100 years later. He was born in Luxembourg. His father came from France, from Alsace-Lorraine, which had been invaded by the Germans in 1870, by Bismarck, taken over. And Robert's father didn't want to stay there, so he went over the border to Luxembourg, and that's where he married a girl from Luxembourg, and Robert was the result. But to get educated, Robert needed to go back into the German-occupied part of France. He was educated in Metz, and then he went to various universities in Germany, Berlin, Bonn, and Munich. And he had to change his nationality 5 times during the war because of the changing borders. So this was occupied by the French, and then by the Germans, then by the French, and so on. And in the First World War, he failed the medical, so he only did clerical jobs. And after the war, he chose to choose the nationality of his father, to become French again, moved back into Alsace-Lorraine, and he was a lawyer, and he was actually given the task of unifying the laws of the German-occupied areas that now came back under French control with the Napoleonic Code. But he wanted to keep the faith-based nature of institutions in Alsace-Lorraine, unlike the rest of France. And even today, the law that covers that part of France is called Lex Schuman, the law of Schuman. And it creates a whole different basis than the rest of France when it comes to faith-based hospitals and schools and so on. There is much more room for faith-based institutions there than in the rest of France, where laïcité, the separation of church and state, is the final word. He was a very devout believer. He's often described as a monk-like figure. His father died when he was very young, and his mother schooled him in the teachings of the church, and also devotional teachings like Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. And he started to build up a library that his mother encouraged him to build. Many of those books were spiritual titles. Now, when the Germans occupied Paris, he was actually sent back to where he came from to look after many of the refugees. He had an official job looking after many of the refugees who were there. And the Germans wanted him to cooperate with their propaganda and so on, and wanted to get him on their side. But it was very clear that he was a man of conscience and character, and he was not prepared to endorse the German rule of that area. So they saw him as a problem, and they put him under house arrest. Actually, they put him in prison for quite a while. And eventually then they changed their tactics. They put him under house arrest. They gave him more freedom. And so that was how he was living for the first 2 years of the war, 2 years. And as he met with the German leaders, they wanted to talk with him, and they kept on trying to get an article or something out of him so they could use his name in the newspapers, because he was so highly respected because of his character and his conscience. But he refused, and he began to learn from the German officers what was happening to the Jews who were being sent off to the concentration camps. And he'd also was going to the library there, and he'd been trained as a statistician. He worked out that there was no way Germany could sustain this war. And he wanted to escape and get this information out into the free zone. So that's what he did. And actually, he went under a false name and managed to get false papers, and was helped by friends to escape and find his way, as he stayed in monasteries, sometimes on the way, hiding there, until he eventually found his way to Lyon and then up to Vichy, where he went to see Marshal Pétain. He was the French stooge premier of France, working under the Germans. Pétain didn't want to hear his story at all, but he began to have some public meetings where he was talking about a hopeful perspective for the future. But he again had to go underground, because after the Allies took over in North Africa, the Germans were afraid of their southern coast. They occupied the whole of France. I'm just going to slow myself down because I think I'm giving the French translator a very hard time. Sorry about that. And he had to go underground again. So he went to a monastery where he stayed underground, and that's where he spent a lot of time thinking, what kind of Europe do we need to build after the war? Even when he was in prison in up there in the north, he was actually in Neustadt in Germany. He smuggled out letters to the French underground. And I had lunch one time with a journalist, a Belgian journalist who had been his right-hand man for a while, doing public relations after the war. And he said, I've read these letters, and they say, Schuman was saying, we French will have to learn to love and forgive the Germans after the war to rebuild Europe. There's no other way. Now, that sounded like treason. In fact, it was used against him after the war to say he was just a German lover. He should be executed. So you can see his Christian response was coming through. And again, when he was in the free zone, he had very agitated discussions with some of his French hosts there, saying the same thing. There's no way forward except to love and forgive the Germans, to be reconciled again after the war. So he was wrestling with major questions. What are the options for us? How can we break the cycle of vengeance and violence that had been habitual between Germany and France? There was a new order needed, something that had never been seen before in history. You've heard of the religious wars, perhaps, maybe the 30 Years' War or the 80 Years' War between Holland and or the Netherlands and Spain. That all came to an end in 1648, when a new order was built based on the competing nation states. And whatever the ruler would be, either of the empire or of the state, everybody had to be Catholic or Calvinist or Lutheran. Those are the three options. It was a step towards freedom of religion, but it wasn't full freedom of religion as we know it today. And so that had led to a balance of power that had some success, but it certainly didn't stop wars from breaking out in Europe. Nationalism had led to wars. Either became too strong in Germany or too weak in France. And for him, the roots of true democracy were all coming from Jesus's teachings, the principle of equality, the practice of brotherly love, of individual freedom, the respect for the rights of the individuals. This is what he saw had come from the teachings of Jesus. And he even said this, and this is a very shocks people today, if you would say, the democracy will either be Christian or it will not be. An anti-Christian democracy will be a parody, which will sink into tyranny or anarchy. Now, we're seeing democracy under severe attack today. We're asking Europe, what's up? Well, the foundations for democracy are being eroded, and people want strong leaders again. And if we forget our Christian roots, this is what is happening. So Robert Schuman actually was drawing a lot of his ideas from a French philosopher named Jacques Maritain. Some of you will know who Jacques Maritain was. He was a leading figure in Vatican II. And these were the issues he was wrestling with. And you can see all of these quotes actually come out of his little book called For Europe. It's just a small little book. You can buy it for €5 from the Robert Schuman Foundation. That's not the same thing as the Schuman Centre for European Studies, which is what we have. But if you were to Google Robert Schuman Foundation or Fondation de la Robert Schuman, excuse my French, you can see how to get that little book in different languages for €5. That's the only book he actually put together. And he said, loving your neighbor as yourself was a democratic principle which applied to nations meant being prepared to serve and love neighboring peoples. Romkje, can you find that book? It's just there on the floor, I think. We've still got all of our books that we used this last week scattered up on my by the at the front. The universal law of love and charity made every man our neighbor, he continued. Here it is, For Europe, and here's the name, Fondation Robert Schuman. That's what you go to, and here's the price. See, €5 it says right there. So the universal law of charity, love and charity made every man our neighbor. Jesus said, love your neighbor. And he asked, who is your neighbor? Is it just the person living next door? What about the neighboring peoples? What about the neighboring countries? What does Jesus's teaching mean for how nations should relate together? And he says, social relations in the Christian world have been based on this law ever since. No race, no nation could claim greater importance in God's eyes than the others. So France and Germany had been habitual enemies. And if Christianity taught that we were children of the same God, regardless of race, color, social status, or profession, nations or states also should be treated as equals. Wow, this was really radical application of Christian faith to politics. And a lot of people think that's just naive. That's impossible. You can't do that. Listen, it was thanks to Schumann's radical application of his Christian faith into politics that we have a European Union at all. Not that he constantly preached and talked and quoted scripture and so on in his political speeches. He never did, never. But this was the driving force behind his thinking. He said, applied to the community of peoples, forgiveness and reconciliation, even with those presently seen as the enemy, were Christian imperatives. And the European story was deeply rooted in the Christian story, and cut off from these roots, Europe would lose the foundations for equality, human dignity, tolerance, and compassion. Europe, he had come to see, had to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. So here now he was developing this vision of the kind of Europe that needed to be formed after the war, a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. This, after the war, of course, even before the end of the war, this photo is taken in 1944 in Yalta. I've actually been to this building in Yalta, where the big three met, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and they were discussing the post-war order. And this is where Stalin and Roosevelt divided up Europe with a great big dividing line between, and Churchill said he felt like a fifth wheel. He wasn't necessary there. This was the beginning of the end of Britain's primary influence in the Western world and the beginning of the American hour. And it was the very next year in Missouri when Churchill preached, sorry, he didn't preach, where he spoke, and he said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Briest in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Actually, when he said that, it's a quote that's often mentioned, He very much upset the American president. That was Truman by this time. Roosevelt died before the war finished. And he upset the British Parliament as well, because he was talking about this Iron Curtain. It was going to offend the Russians and so on, but he was speaking out the truth. After the war, Robert Schuman was invited to become part of the cabinet. He was actually the first finance minister after the war, because he was such a trustworthy person. Even though he had his enemies who tried to make him a German lover, they misunderstood his Christian motivation towards loving and forgiving the Germans. De Gaulle nevertheless stood behind him, although de Gaulle's approach to the European problem was very, very different from Schuman. De Gaulle wanted to reshape Europe in France's image, which really meant reshaping it in his image. La France, c'est moi, he often said. He could have said, l'Europe, c'est moi. And then when he did embrace Adenauer and the Germans, well, you read different versions about that. The way I read it is that he was really saying, you've got to keep your enemies close to you. He didn't have the same heart towards the Germans as Robert Schuman did, a heart of forgiveness. But there was even a stage in 1947 where Robert Schuman, for 7 months, was the prime minister. In fact, governments only lasted about 7 months, and they kept on rising and falling. And the Communist Party was very strong in France, because the communists had so opposed the Nazis. They were very popular in France. And so they had a lot of support. But the Communist Party was under the control of the Kremlin, and they were wanting them all the time. The communists, the workers, the members of the trade unions, to bring down the democratic governments and to install a communist government. And it was a very, very dicey affair. For the 5 years after the war were years of fear and uncertainty. And nobody wanted to go back to another war, but they saw it coming. And how could they avoid it? It would be a war now with the Soviet nations. And so France was being torn by strikes at the time when Robert Schuman was prime minister. And even in the parliament there, he would be attacked viciously from the floor by communist delegates there. And he would often just bow his head in silent prayer, asking God for the grace and the wisdom to know how to respond. And he called in the army, and he dealt with these strikes in a very firm way. And his record there is one of strong leadership. But really what he wanted to do was work as the foreign minister, because there was an unfinished task of reconciliation between the Germans and the French. And as prime minister, he had to deal with such a broad palette of responsibilities that he wanted to focus on the foreign affairs aspect. Now, it was actually while he was still prime minister that he had a conversation on a train with a businessman who had just returned from a place in Switzerland, C-A-U-X, high above Montreux, the eastern end of Lake Geneva, or Lac Léman, that this center was called the Center for the Reconciliation of the Nations. And this businessman was very excited about what he had just experienced, because he saw there trade unionists and the employers, the owners of coal mines up in the north of France, in Lille, who were being reconciled with each other, because this center was the center of a movement known as the Moral Rearmament Center. This was a movement that was Christian-based and talked about starting a changed world with a changed heart in ourselves. And they talked about values you need to live by, values of honesty, values of truth, values of selflessness. I forget the fourth one right now, but so they started to bring together the leaders from different nations, trade unionists, business people, politicians, church leaders, society leaders, newspaper people, to come and discuss what foundations can we build on for a new Europe. Now, Schuman's ears really picked up at this story. That's the kind of thing that needs to happen. And he recognized in there many of the principles of the Catholic social thinking that he had been schooled in as well, which had come out of the late 19th century, 1891, the encyclical Rare Novarum, yeah, from Pope Leo the 13th, I think it was, who taught a vision for society that was not based on leftist thinking, it was not based on rightist thinking, but it was based on understanding of human beings as created in the image of God, and therefore always choosing for the common good. And out of that came the principle of solidarity, and also the principle of subsidiarity, that decisions should be taken as locally as possible instead of always being centralized. And these four principles had given birth to the Christian democratic movement, well, after the war. But it had beforehand many conferences and so on. There were different plans for seeing Europe rebuilt. And this is what Robert Schuman was now picking up on. But he saw it at work. When he heard this, the story of what was taking place in Corrie, he said, I want to hear about that. It was actually been many years, actually 1952 or 3, still another 4 or 5 years before Schuman would get to this place. But I show you this photo now, looking down on Lake Geneva, looking from the Montreux end towards Lausanne and Geneva at the other end. This was a great hotel. It looks like a Disneyland building that was built at the end of the first of the 19th century, maybe the beginning of the 20th century. But anyway, for the world's rich to come there. The Maharaji from India sometimes came there and rented a whole floor for his harem as well. We visited his room, which is made up with furniture made up from lemon trees, especially, and you can still smell the sweet scent of lemon there. But during the war, it was vacated. The hotels were empty, just like during Corona time, and so it became a place of refuge, and even escaped Allied servicemen would find their way there. And so the place was really in a mess after the war. And this movement decided they wanted to buy this. In fact, there were about 80 Swiss families who met at Interlaken in 1946, and they began to pool their resources. They sold jewelry, they sold their second houses and so on. They raised the money to buy this place and then began to work with elbow grease on renovating this whole place to turn it into a place for the reconciliation of the nations. Now, Frank Buchmann, who's standing there on the right with Robert Schuman, when he finally arrived there, Frank Buchmann's first visit to this place, all his fellow workers, he was the leader of this movement. He was a Lutheran evangelist, actually. And he had started this movement and called it moral rearmament. It used to be called the Oxford movement, but when all the nations were rearming for the Second World War, he said, what this world needs is a moral rearmament. And when he first came to visit this place, and all his fellow colleagues from the movement were really proud, wanting him to show this place that they had bought, he looked around and he said, the first thing he said was, Germans, where are the Germans? How are we going to rebuild Europe without the Germans? You must bring the Germans in here. And so the very first delegation from Germany was allowed out of the Allied zones to go to this place. The Germans were not allowed to travel at all. There was a total curfew after the war. But moral rearmament got the release of these Germans to come there. And here we see some of the German delegates, along with others from other nations. And the name of Konrad Adenauer will be familiar to many of you. He became the first chancellor of Western Germany. But before he was chancellor, he started to come there, and he brought many family members with him over the years. This was a favorite place for him to come to because he too was a devout Catholic believer who had been schooled in the principles of Catholic social thinking, and he recognized the dynamics of this movement is what Europe needed. And when Schuman met with, coming back in our story to now 1948, he said, I want to meet this man, Buchmann. And so a meal was arranged for him somewhere in France through mutual friends. And that's where Schuman was sharing with Buchmann. He said, actually, Schuman said, I feel like I'm getting an old man. I need to retire. I want to go to a monastery and write books. What do you think I should do? And Buchmann said, what does your heart tell you to do? Now, this was a basic principle of the moral rearmament movement, was listening to the voice of the conscience, listening to the voice of God. And they still do that today, even though they have become a Christian-initiated movement for people of all faiths and none. They still practice in their conferences, for those who want to do it, to come together, wait on God, and listen to his voice. And this is what he told Schuman. And Schuman laughed with embarrassment. He said, well, yeah, I knew you'd say something like that. He said, I know what I need to do. My job is not yet finished. I need to work for the reconciliation of the Germans and the French. But who can I trust? I don't know who to trust on the German side. And that's when Buchmann said, we have some fine men there. And he had in mind people like Konrad Adenauer. And so it was through this connection that Schuman and Adenauer began a trust relationship. Some of you may know the great tension between France and Western Germany after the war, particularly around the Saar area. And the Saar area is where Robert Schuman actually was under house arrest and in prison. And this was the coal mining area. It was very, very important for the German war effort. But now the French were threatening to take it over, annex it forever. And so there was tension between Adenauer and Schuman. This was not Schumann's idea, that was his predecessor's idea. And at one stage, Adenauer got upset about Schuman. Schuman wasn't present at the time, and he called him a lying Alsatian because he came from Alsace. And then he caught himself and he said, oh, no, but I know I have to look at my own self before I start looking at other people. A changed world begins with my own changed heart. And that's how these two men grew a trust relationship. There's a third member that needs to be brought into the picture too. I don't have photos here, but his name was De Gasperi, Alcide De Gasperi. He was the Italian prime minister who also had a similar Catholic background, understood Catholic social thinking, who'd stood up against Mussolini, had been put in prison because of that. And he also had shared the same principles as did Schuman and Adenauer. And eventually, Adenauer said to Schuman, once they had signed the Treaty for the European Coal and Steel Community, Adenauer said to Schuman, I consider it an act of providence, or I consider it providential, that the main weight of the task has to rebuild Europe has laid on the shoulders of men like you, our brother De Gasperi, and myself, who are filled with a desire to build a new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations. That's getting ahead of our story. It was eventually on May the 9th, 1950, that Robert Schuman made an announcement in Paris that only took him 3 minutes. I've been talking to you for more than just 3 minutes. You can't even boil an egg in 3 minutes or make a cup of coffee in 3 minutes. But in this 3-minute speech, Robert Schuman laid the foundation for the House of Europe, in which today half a billion Europeans have been living together in peace. It was a total surprise when he actually announced his plan. Even the prime minister didn't fully know his plan. At this stage, he had put down his prime ministership and he was the foreign minister. And he had not fully brought the prime minister into the picture because he was afraid the prime minister might shoot it down. I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but you see, on the 10th of May, Schuman had to meet with the American Secretary of State and the British foreign minister. And the American Secretary of State, his name was Dean Acheson, he had told Schuman, you need to come up with a plan. We've got to find a way to bring Germany, Western Germany, back in to the society of civilized nations. and democratic nations. And so Schuman realized he had to come with a plan. How could they do it? Different ones had different ideas. One person had the idea, well, we're going to create a buffer state between Germany and France so they can't go to war again. And we'll call it Lothringen. That was going to be Alsace-Lorraine together. But Schuman and his people said, no, we never allow that. We do not want to have an independence from those other nations. What they began to realize was this: we need to bring these nations together, or the heavy industries of these nations, coal and steel, under a supranational authority, because those industries are necessary for a war effort. You cannot have a war without coal and steel. But if you can't, and you cannot build your own war machine without your independent control of those industries. But if you make those industries interdependent, then you will not be able to go to war again. And what his plan was, a concrete way, find a concrete economic way to make war unthinkable. Now, even that thought was almost unthinkable, that war could become unthinkable. And so he agreed on this plan. His people were putting this plan together, how to unite the coal and steel industries, particularly of France and Germany, but of any other nations that will be prepared to come and be on board. And in fact, the Italians and the Belgians and the Dutch and the Luxembourgians said, yes, we are in. And this was the plan that was announced on May the 9th, 1950. Now, I consider this moment to be the decisive moment of post-war European history, because the day before there was no plan on the table. When he tabled this plan, there was a plan that others began to respond to. They rejected it, they modified it, they did, but it was the plan that was on the table. And that has eventually led, firstly, to the European Coal and Steel Community, then to the EEC, 1956-57, the Treaty of Rome, the European Economic Community, and then to the European Community, which then became the European Union in 1992. There would not have been a European Union without this Christian-motivated reconciliation, forgiveness, where one party said to the other party, we are going to accept you on equal terms. You see, the temptation was to do what the Allies had done after World War I, and that was to put all the heavy weight of the war damages on the defeated party. But Schuman understood that would never work. That was only going to continue the recycling vengeance and bitterness that made it possible for a Hitler to take control in Germany. And it was on Christian understanding of forgiveness. And what Romkje talked before about Corrie saying, our sins are forgiven and buried in the deepest sea, and as far as the east is from the west, so he has separated our sins from us. Schuman understood that forgiveness needed to be applied not only on a personal level, but on a national level, on an international level as well. And that's why these two stories go together, and that both the micro and the macro level are absolutely key to understand for the future of Europe. And this is actually what led to, I think it was 2013, 2012, 2013, when the European Union was then awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for the peace that had come to Europe. And people say, yes, but what about, it was NATO, it was the Marshall Plan. That's what's given us peace. Well, let's think about that a little bit. Yes, those two very generous projects that the Americans initiated and supported have been absolutely essential. They've not been sufficient, but they've been absolutely essential for peace in Europe. But they were like scaffolding on the outside of a building. The European building actually had to have a heart transformation on the inside. Without that forgiveness and reconciliation amongst Europeans, you could put up all sorts of scaffolding, but it cannot hold the building up. The building needs its own foundations, and only by drilling down to the Christian foundations could this house be rebuilt. And it was a reconciliation that took place between the Germans and the French and the others, all others involved. That made it possible for them to come together as equals and to sit around in the circle and look at the political problem together from different angles and come to consensus. And so the European Parliament does not have a parliamentary, a government party and an opposition. There's no opposition. They are all working together. Some of them are right wing, some of them are left wing, some of them are centrists and so on. But they look at the problem together, and there are all sorts of committees drawing from different countries. You actually have stronger ties internationally than you do with your own nationality. You can be there, you might be a right winger, you'll have strong ties with all the right wingers from Europe, much stronger than the left wing, than with left wingers from your own nation, for example. And so the commitment to equality, you can see there in the European Parliament building and all the facilities, all the institutions, where all the documents are translated into all the 25, 27, I'm not sure how many languages there are, official languages within the European Union. Just think, that requires a colossal amount of work. And sometimes we hear, oh, but there's such a huge bureaucracy there in Brussels and in Strasbourg. That's not really true. If you take away, especially all these people who are translating and interpreting, you have the bureaucracy of a medium-sized city. It's not really true that there's this huge democracy that's being built there to govern all of our lives. When we talk about Brussels, we're actually talking about our collective responsibility there in that city, who are making, our collective representatives there in that city, who are making decisions on our behalf. Our prime ministers love to go there, and they talk nationalistic language at home. They go to Brussels, they make decisions together, they come home and they say, well, Brussels decided that. Well, who's Brussels? It's all our representatives together. And so this understanding of equality is worked out in the structures of the EU, the checks and balances, the fact that every 6 months, the presidency of the EU rotates between the different countries. And in 2017, it was Malta who had the presidency. When the Brexit talks were open, here's little old Malta, 450,000 people, used to be a little colony of Britain, now is chairing the meetings in which they're talking about Britain exiting from the EU. Now, this is where the small guys are taken seriously along with the big guys. The alternative is this: if we didn't have an EU, we'd go back to the big guys telling everybody else what had to happen. That's happened at the Treaty of Münster. That happened in Utrecht in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht. That happened in Vienna in 1817 with the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe that started, when the big guys told the little guys what they had to do. In fact, it was there that Holland was told it had to become a monarchy. Before that had been a republic. So we have to think carefully. If we were to dismantle this current situation, we'd have to reinvent it in some way. How would we reinvent it? What foundations? So this is why it's so important for us as Christians to recognize our responsibility for helping to shape the future. You see, one of the things Robert Schuman said right from the start, this project must not just be an economic and technological project. It needs a soul. And Jacques Delors, who was the president of the European Commission for several terms, and he was really the guy who got things going again after it bogged down in the 70s and the 80s. When he retired in 1992 from being the European president of the Commission, he gathered religious leaders together and he said to them, if we have not found a soul for Europe, for the European Union, and he said, I mean by this, spirituality and meaning. If we've not found that soul within the next 10 years, the game will be over. Now, that was 1992. It's now 28 years since then. We are 18 years past his deadline. And some of the things we see happening in Europe is a fulfillment of what he was prophesying. We need to find a soul, but who can find a soul? What is the soul of something? The soul is the life source. It's where the values came from. It's what breathed life into something. It's an analogy of the soul of a person. What breathed life into the European Union project? Of course, it had input from all sources, but without that Christian input, which starts with an understanding of human beings created in the image of God. I can't read that, but that's okay. Hold up your hands and tell me how many minutes I've got. I can't see. Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's what I was reckoning on. If we did not have that Christian understanding of forgiveness and reconciliation, if we didn't have the Christian understanding of humans being created in the image of God, if we didn't have the command to love our neighbor as ourselves, if we didn't have the understanding of moral equality before God that comes from the Bible, if we didn't believe in that concept the Bible calls agape, love, that actually made Europe possible, which is another whole talk we could do one day, we wouldn't have Europe. The story of Jesus is the single greatest factor in making Europe Europe. And there are even secular people who are beginning to realize this. People like Tom Holland, perhaps you've come across some of his name, who's written a book just now called Dominion that talks about how Christianity really has shaped our Western world. And he uses the illustration, if we are the goldfish in a goldfish bowl, the water we are swimming in is Christianity. So we need to recognize this is our story. We need to accept responsibility. We need people who are going to be like Robert Schuman, who go into politics as Christians. He seriously considered becoming a monk, especially after his mother died in a sad accident. She was still quite young. And he thought, I'm going to retire and go into a monastery. And one of his friends said to him, you know, the next generation of saints are going to be wearing suits. They're going to be lawyers, they're going to be politicians and so on. And we need people who are politicians. We need people who are journalists. We need people who are going to become academics and teachers, shaping the thinking and understanding, going back to the past, retelling the stories of what God has done in the past, so that we can see where God wants to go in the future, so that we can understand how we can align our life with God's purposes from the past and into the future as well. Now, just back to this photo of these three men, Hammond with Romkje. Perhaps some of you know him as a Belgian. He is actually also a very godly person, a believer who would go into prayer retreats. I've met him on a couple of occasions. And he of the three is the one here who had the strongest Christian faith. But I was actually telling some of this story to a group of young people, Christian young people in the European Parliament, when I had a European parliamentarian sitting next to me from Finland, Sari Esia. And while I was telling the story, there were also some messages coming in on her phone that she was responding to. And I thought, oh, something's happening. So when I finished the story, she said, you know, just while Jeff has been speaking, the news has just come in that the European Union will receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is a fulfillment, really, of the story that Jeff has been talking about. So that was wonderful, a wonderful sense of coincidence. And so I'm going to round off here and tell you that Robert Schuman talked about both the soul of Europe and the spirit of Europe. And we cannot expect politicians to talk that language, because this is the task for God's, for the faith communities to be involved. And so I'm going to finish here with this quote: Europe cannot and must not remain an economic and technical enterprise. It needs a soul.
So we're back again. Thank you so much for your speech. You warned us, right? You really can talk like a waterfall, but it's really very good. And
like a fountain. Huh?
Like a fountain, yes. It's in your name. It's wonderful. I think I have a lot to think about, and I've got a lot of inspiration, especially from this personal history of Robert Schuman itself. And now I think we've seen one very great and wonderful woman and a very big and strong man who worked one on a more personal level and the other on a very political and a high, powerful level for reconciliation in Europe and for unity. Thank you so much. We received a question from our live stream. I think it was from the French translation, so the second live stream we have here. Thank you very much for the question. And it's a personal question to you, Jeff. It's you were director of Youth with a Mission. How did it came that you changed from this work from Youth with a Mission to your heart that you now have for Europe, that you founded 10 years ago, the Schuman Centre for European Studies?
Especially as a person from New Zealand, of course. It's also interesting.
Yes, well, I had no plans to become a missionary. I had no plans to come and live in Europe. That's another long story. But there was a time I actually came to Europe, firstly managing a company of singers, dancers, and musicians. We had concerts here in Holland and in England. I went back to Canada where we were based. One weekend, I had 3 strong impressions. I should return to Europe, return to journalism, and live in a community. Then 3 days later, I got a letter from one of the leaders of Youth with a Mission asking me to come and edit a magazine that they were putting out. And I would live on this community, this training community called Hautecombe, where we lived for 43 years. So that was a very clear answer. And so one of the things I developed there was a personal passion to understand how has God been at work in history. I studied history at university. My history professor told me there was no meaning in history. Historians used to look for meaning. I began to think, well, why should I come back to your lecture tomorrow? Because the day after tomorrow it won't have any meaning. And so this has been a deep concern for me. And I began to see, working in a mission organization, I began to realize that there were these different movements throughout history, not just Protestant movements, but all the way through history, who had, by their faith, really shaped Europe. And I began to teach about missions history. And the more I taught, the more I then connected the dots together and saw there was a domino effect happening. One group affected another group, affected another group, and so on. And I began to discover what our place was to be in affecting other groups in the future. And then in 1990, in 1990, actually 1988, I was asked by my leader, would I consider prayerfully taking on the leadership role of Youth with a Mission in Europe? We didn't actually have a role for that. So I told him yes, on one condition, that he was to solve all the major problems in Europe first. So as 1989 began to roll around, and then the barbed wire between Austria and Hungary was rolled up, and then the Berlin Wall came down, and by the end of the year, Ceausescu was dead and buried in Romania. Wow, I was very impressed with my leader, so I wrote him a letter to thank him for keeping his side of the bargain and recognizing I had to keep mine. So that forced me to ask the question, what is God doing in Europe? What is on his heart? What does he want to do? And I began to look around for the men and women, the fathers and mothers who had God's heart for Europe. And I discovered then there were very few in my constituency, evangelicals, who even thought about Europe. It was the Catholics that had the heart for Europe, who had the bigger vision for Europe. Cardinal Basil Hume's book, Remaking Europe, became a place of inspiration of getting all sorts of biblical perspective on Europe today from there. Then I began to discover about Catholic social thinking. And so I took my leadership team from YWAM Europe. We went to Brussels and we had an appointment with a man there in the commission to ask, what should we think about Brussels? I asked many of my evangelical colleagues and they thought, oh, don't get involved in Europe. It's going to become the beast and all this kind of negative thinking. And at this meeting, the very first thing that this official who greeted us said was, shall we begin with prayer? That was the last thing we expected from an EU official. And he actually headed up a prayer network in the whole of the European Commission building there in Berlaymont. He was an Irish Catholic charismatic, and his name was Eamon O'Rourke. And he began to tell the story of Robert Schuman. And I said, I've never heard this story before. It was always a Roman plot this is not the story of reconciliation and forgiveness. This is a story of reconciliation and forgiveness. This is not what I grew up on. More of my people need to hear the story. Come and help me. Would you help me organize a consultation? So in 1992, we held an event in Brussels, right opposite Berlaymont there, with evangelical leaders to begin to explore what is the foundation, what are the foundations, and what is our responsibility. We had Catholic and Protestant speakers there as well. And that led to a whole series of forums. We used to hold the New Europe Forum, the New Europe Student Forum. Then we started the State of Europe Forum, which we've been doing since 2010, holding it when there's no corona in the capital of the country, holding the presidency of the EU to bring Christians together, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, from all different disciplines, to look at the state of Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for it to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. That's our common point. And so this is what got me on this track. I woke up to the fact that my background didn't take Europe seriously. Christopher Dawson is a Catholic historian who said this: Catholics see the woods, Protestants see trees. And he meant by that after the Reformation, Europe was divided up into territorial churches, or the Catholic Church, which saw the big picture. Now, but then from these Protestant churches came all sorts of free church offsprings, perhaps for very good theological reasons. But it meant that those free church movements, mainly evangelical, they saw their local churches as the beginning and the end of everything. So I say, not only do Catholics see the woods, Protestants see the trees, but evangelicals see the branches. And that's why we need to learn from the whole body of Christ. And I have been greatly enriched by my connections there with Catholic thinkers.
Yeah, we have a video who is actually like a trailer of announcing this festival, also in the other European countries. And actually we share about that. We have different denominations, we have different languages, different backgrounds, but we have the same culture of encounter. And actually, you speak a lot about that. It's very important to forgive each other, to have this encounter, to have this reconciliation, unity. And is it possible also to give an example nowadays that we live now, more recently, what needs this reconciliation? I found it also really beautiful what you said, like to change the world, it starts to change my own heart. Do you have examples of today where we need to change our hearts?
Can I just add something to what Jeff said? He had been the European director for 20 years. You see, the organization is called Youth with a Mission. So when Jeff turned 60, he felt he should really give that over to younger people. And that's when we got involved with the Schuman Centre for European Studies. So it wasn't that he didn't like the job or anything, but it was just that he wasn't a youth anymore. We still like to think we are youth, but we are not. So I let you answer the next question, but I think it's important to realize that, and there's so much still to do with the Schuman Centre for European Studies. We don't feel that we need to be youth, that we can still do it now.
And what did Corrie say to you when you started Youth with a Mission in Holland?
Oh, she said to me, I wish I were still a youth with a mission. So she was a very, warm supporter of Youth with a Mission. And that's what we love, to be involved still with the young people of Youth with a Mission. Actually, we still are officially with the organization, but not anymore on a leadership level or anything. We're just members, so to speak.
Yeah, the Schuman Centre still operates under the authority of Youth with a Mission, and we still continue to live in self-denial when it comes to our name. We're still Youth with a Mission.
And I think both of you have a very young spirit.
Well, I think it keeps you young, living with young people. We once went on holiday to Turkey. It's filled with people with grey hair. We looked around and we said, how are we going to...
Oh, your microphone, Jeff, turned a little bit...
Okay. Okay. I was saying we went on a holiday to Turkey, one of these charter flights, and everybody had grey hair. And we thought, how are we going to survive going on a holiday with people our own age? Back to your question. On our Celtic heritage trip we've just done, and the one before that was the Continental. We went through on the continent, and then we did through the British Isles and Ireland. We came across reconciliation centers in Dresden, which had been terribly bombed, and in Coventry, which had been bombed by the Germans back in 1940. And both these cathedrals in both cities are now the centers of reconciliation. The International Reconciliation Centre been working toward bringing reconciliation again and again. And of course, it had to happen again at the time of the when the Berlin Wall came down. Much reconciliation happened. And actually what took place in Western Europe has not really happened at a heart level across in the former communist world. And we still have not yet laid the solid foundations for what needs to happen there. It gives us an idea of the work that still needs to happen. But in terms of reconciliation going on today, the International Reconciliation Centre developed that cross with two nails, two nails from and a support nail that is a symbol of reconciliation that has. They now have 330 centers around the world where the work of reconciliation has gone on between Tutsis and Hutsis, Serbs and Croatians, wherever there's been conflict. And I've told this story in the Ukraine and Kiev to the chairwoman of the European Affairs Committee, the parliament there, who brought in some of her workers. And we talked about what does this mean for the current conflict, and how radical Schuman's standpoint was, saying we will have to learn to love and forgive the Germans. It's equivalent like saying the Ukrainians will have to learn to love and forgive the Russians. The chairwoman was very moved by this and talking about, yes, this is the lesson we need to bring. So she's asked me to come back for further conferences there. We were supposed to have one concerning corruption earlier this year, but it had to be done online on Zoom because of the corona. But it is still a very, very highly relevant message for today. Yeah, and bring it down to Corrie's level in our own families, our own neighborhoods, our own cities. This needs to be taking place, and we, as part of our role, as part of the ministry of reconciliation, Paul talks about in his letters.
Yeah, it's very clear. Yeah, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Maybe a little question. We have like 1 minute left. Very shortly about, actually, it's just we live now in this Corona time, and it's also, yes, in Europe, it's in different countries. Different countries have different opinions. Can you say a little short word about this, how we live this time also, yeah, in these different countries together?
Yes, this is why we need dialogue. This is why we need to understand. This is why we need to have a meeting of hearts, not just starting to meet on our points of differences, but find commonality. And this is a very key thing. I have an English friend, Michael Schluter, who's been working very much to see this happen, for example, in North and South Korea. But you don't start with your differences, you try to find common ground. The same thing in Sudan. We actually have a foster daughter who worked in Sudan before the referendum there, trying to prepare the way for the referendum. And these are based on finding the common ground first before you start to tackle the differences. Finding your common humanity, discovering that God's image in each of us behind the facade that we projected on our enemies. And this is a starting point for reconciliation.
So much. Thank you so much for the thing you've shared with us. Unfortunately, we run a little bit out of time, and we'll finish this. This 2 hours. We thank all the participants who watched this workshop online on YouTube and the 2 live streams. Thank you very much that you've been with us, and I think you've got a lot to think about, and we really invite you to continue our festival, because it's not finished yet. We invite you to continue with the prayer for unity at 7 p.m. here on YouTube, and afterwards we have a wonderful worship evening from the Hautecombe Abbey at 9 p.m. also here on YouTube. Nice to see you there.
Lovely to see you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much that we could be part of your celebration.
And special thanks to the French translator. I gave her a very hard afternoon.
I tried to slow him down a bit, but
It's very, very well. Yes, we are very thankful, and yes, we wish you to see also in the future. Maybe we can also talk more about this topic.
Yes, of course. I think it will be a lot of stuff. It will be very interesting.
okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, there's so much to say, so you have to be fast to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's difficult, and